I leave it totally up to you, and especially if you're this way, you can actually see the screen.
Was someone there to let you in? Outside. To let you in from outside. Oh, okay, I told you, you ran the door and left people. Oh. Maybe I better. Where'd you go this morning? Good morning. What? I posted this morning. Yeah, good morning. No, but not everyone knows where the board is. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Yes, welcome back to Mrs. Sochachevsky. It's nice to have you back here. Okay, folks, so let's get started. And let me share my screen with you. I'll just bring up the documents on the screen. Just give me one sec. There we go. And share the screen. And here we go. Okay, I hope everyone can see what we have up here on the screen now. Okay, so first of all, I just wanted to express, I'll lower my mask because I'm having a coffee. I wanted to express my gratitude to all of the students past and present and future for sticking with us for all of this time as we've gone through the first 3 essays of the Kuzari. You won't be tested on any of it because it's taken us a very, very long time to get through it. But one of the big questions that some of the students of the Kuzari really struggle with is the mivneh, or the structure of the Kuzari. Why Rebbe Yehuda Halevi chose to divide it into 5 ma'amarim, 5 essays, and whether there's a thematic a structure to each one of the 5 sections. Rav Shlomo Toledano is still with us, thankfully. He's 80 years old. He's a professor as well. And he has an institute called, I think it's called the Toledano Institute. He's written a number of Sfarim on Jewish thought, which means, in other words, they're all in Hebrew, and they're all called Machshava V'Dibur. And he's got one on Moreh Nevuchim. He's got one on the Kuzari. He's got one on Chovot HaLevavot, Rabbeinu Bachaya's work on the duties of the heart. And his 4th one is on Rav Yosef Albo Sefer HaIkarim, which is the book of fundamentals or dogma within Judaism. And he basically sets out to not only explain those works, but to really show the structure and to help us really try to understand what the author was trying to accomplish. And he gives some very, very interesting insights. I am somewhat ambivalent on the way that he presents the structure of the first 4 of the 5 ma'amarim of the Kuzari, but I'm very impressed by the way that he's presented it. My only ambivalence is this really what Rebbe Yehuda Halevi had in mind? But I think it's worthwhile to go through this and for us to try, before we even embark on the 4th essay, to try and understand what Rebbe Yehuda Halevi's structure is in Sefer HaKuzari. So he writes this as the introduction to the 4th essay, and he writes, Haseder shel Sefer HaKuzari, the order. He says, Nazkir ki hanosei she'over kichut hashani b'chol Sefer HaKuzari. Let us recall that the subject that passes through like a scarlet thread through all of this work of Kuzari, hu ha'inyan ha'eloki. It's a term that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi coins, which is called, we just call it the divinity in our translation, but it's called Amar Allahi, which is the Arabic term, and it's Inyan Ha'eloki, the divine matter, or the divine issue, that is something that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi describes as almost like a Shekhinah, a divine presence that is the goal of every Jew to attach to. Ha'inyan ha'eloki hu chibur im Hashem. It represents attachment to God, or what we would call dvekus, right? Attachment. Chibur shaba lidei bitui b'kiyum al tiv'i. It is an attachment that finds its expression in supernatural fulfillment. B'kiyum lo deterministi. I guess that's an English word. It finds its fulfillment in a non-deterministic life, meaning that everything that happens is because of the Yad Hashem, because of our attachment to God. B'tziut ba kayam ha'inyan ha'eloki, the existence wherein this inyan ha'eloki exists, hi mitziut ba ha'hesber lihistoria. It is an existence that provides meaning or explanation for all of human history. Eino chomri, it's not just physical. Eino socio-economy, o tziv'i politi. It is neither socioeconomic, nor is it militaristic or political. Ela musari ruchani eloki. But it sort of depicts history as being something that is provides ethical teaching, spiritual and divine sort of essence or teaching. The mitziut zu, this kind of existence, gam ha'hesper lema'oraot b'chayei haprat, eino ma'amadi chinuchi psikologi uchdome. He says, in this kind of existence where everything is infused with godliness, the explanation or the rationale for all that goes on in the life of the individual as well is not, how do you translate ma'amadi? How would you translate that? Just happenstance, perhaps, or educational or psychological and so forth. Ela musari ruchani eloki. But it too is either ethical, spiritual, or divine in nature. Everything that occurs to me in life, because God is with me and God is guiding this existence, has some kind of divine lesson. Chibur ze im ha'elokim ba lidei bitui gam bipritzat machsomei hasechel uvitfisat al u're'iyah berura yoter shel hakiyum. It says this attachment to God finds its expression also through the breaking of the restraints of the intellect. Now, this, of course, is something that is the hallmark of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, that the human being's calling is to transcend the intellect, not to utilize the intellect as Maimonides, promotes, to find God, but to transcend the intellect, because the intellect is limited, according to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Uvitfisat al, and to try and grasp that which is above, u're'iyah berura yoter shel hakiyum, and to see more than just existence. Ha'inyan ha'eloki hu b'kitzur, historia, pil'it, u'nevuah. So to summarize, therefore, inyan ha'eloki really is supernatural or magical history and prophecy. That's really what it boils down to, is the ability for the human being to experience God on a supernatural level and to have a prophetic experience. So that's the overarching theme of the Kuzari, is to find God and to transcend the intellect and to transcend nature. The Chelik Revi'i Zeh Shel Sefer HaKuzari, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi Alav HaShalom Matziga T'Anyan HaEloki BaTorah. So in this fourth essay, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is going to present to us where we can trace this Inyan Eloki, this divinity, in the verses of the Torah. Achein nosei chelik zehem. He says, so therefore, the subjects that are contained within this section of the Kuzari are as follows. So he has a bulleted list here. Shemot HaElokim, the names of God. Shemot HaElokim BaTorah, Heim Madregot Shonot, Begilui HaElokim Livnei Adam. So first of all, we have to accept that the fact that God has multiple names by which he is known means that he is revealing a different aspect of himself. Each name connotes a different aspect of God that he is revealing to mankind. Heim im kain bitui li'inyan ha'eloki. And therefore, this is an expression of this divinity that infuses man's existence. Okay, so once we know the reason why, I guess, Rabbi Yehuda Levi wants to educate us on the different names is to expose us to this idea of the different manifestations of God in our life. So that's point number one. And that's the first subject that we're going to encounter in the fourth essay, which will be try and understand why God is known by different names and what those names are. Hanevuah, prophecy. Tofa'at hanevuah nimsara lanu b'Torah. So the result of prophecy is passed down to us, or the manifestation of prophecy is revealed to us in the Torah. V'hi kemuvan habitui hamuvhak biyoter shel ha'inyan ha'eloki. Why is prophecy related to the divinity? Because it is the most clear and manifest expression of the inyan ha'eloki, divinity in this world. God shows us what he wants and what he expects and what he's all about in the Torah. And the Torah comes to us through prophecy. So prophecy will be the next topic of this ma'amar. Then we have the third issue, which is bayat hagshama, the problem with corporeality. Bayat hagshama hi bayata shel sfat Torah meviah mesarim min Hashem el bnei ha'adam. So this is the sort of the problem, he says, of the language of the Torah. So Rabbi Yehuda Levi is going to try and dispel all the anthropomorphic terms that appear in the Torah. Of course, we know that the Rambam in his Moreh Nevuchim is dedicated to that project as well. And we'll have to see how Rabbi Yehuda Levi differs, if at all, from the project of the Rambam in that respect, which is to dispel any corporeal attribution to God. But it is part of the message that God brings to man, and tries to where God manifests himself with a corporeal depiction in the Torah. We'll have to understand why that is and how that helps us understand Hashem and his manifestation in our lives. Okay, so that's the third topic. And then the fourth topic is HaChochmot Ba'am Yisrael, the wisdoms, the areas of wisdom or knowledge that are found within the Jewish nation. Remember, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is the great cheerleader for Klal Yisrael. He really is. In other words, in a sense, not only is he a defender of Judaism, but he is so proud of being a Jew. And that pride spills over in every page in the Kuzari, with rare exception. There are times he says, you got me. I'm not so proud of this particular one little thing. But as a general rule, he says, I'm a very proud Jew. And part of his expression of pride in the fourth essay is to disclose to the reader so many of the areas of wisdom that are present within Am Yisrael. Now, we saw a little bit of that in the third Maimar. If you remember, he talked a lot about how the wisdom of the sages in the third Ma'amar. If you remember, one of the areas of disputation that he had with was with the Karaites, and he wanted to show these rabbis were not dummies. The rabbis who the Karaites dismiss, the rabbis know a tremendous amount, and to witness how much they knew about astronomy, zoology, biology, botany, and all of these other things, right? And agriculture. They had tremendous wisdom. But let's see. HaChochmot ba'am Yisrael kololot et HaChochma ha'al-tivit. So first of all, part of the wisdom that exists within the Jewish people is about that which is supernatural or metaphysical. Metaphysika sheba alidei bitui b'sefer yitzira. He's going to Rabbi Yehuda Levi at the end of the fourth essay will go into an extensive discussion of a work called Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Creation. Have any of you ever heard of the Book of Creation? You're familiar with that work? Right? It predates Rabbi Yehuda Levi by several centuries. Its origin, we'll learn about the origin that goes back allegedly to Adam Harishon, but it sort of comes to publication sometime in the period of the Gaonim, 8th, 9th, or even 10th century possibly. But it is a book on metaphysics, on basically how God created this all of existence, and et astronomia sheba lidei bitui b'chokhmat ha'ibor. Rabbi Yehuda Levi will also talk about the great wisdom of astronomy that finds its expression in the sages' discussion of reconciling the solar calendar with the lunar calendar. Because as you know, the Jewish calendar is a luni-solar calendar, not a luni solar calendar, but a luni-solar, LUNI-SOLAR, which means that it is a reconciled calendar between the moon's motions and the sun's motions, and that's something that involves a lot of complex computation, and that's another area of wisdom of astronomy. Physiologia v'habiologia shemofiot b'hilchot treifot va'od. Physiology and biology that manifest themselves in the laws of treifot, in Masechet Chulin, which talks all about how to ascertain whether an animal is kosher depending upon defects or injuries in certain vital organs of the animal. And the rabbis must have had a great knowledge of anatomy and biology in order for them to be able to make these determinations. And then there's other things as well. So all of these things, I guess these four categories, the names of God, prophecy, the corporeal depiction of God, and the various areas of wisdom which exist within the Jewish people, all trace their way back to this Inyan HaEloki, which represents the fact that the Jewish people attach themselves to Hashem and find God in their history, is the way that Rav Toledano is representing it. As you can see, these are all loose connections. You have to sort of be very abstract in your thinking in order to be able to connect these dots together, right? So based on that, he comes to the conclusion, Havanit yaches ka'et lemikumo shel hachelak harevi'i b'toch sefer hakuzari. And therefore, let us put the fourth essay in its proper place in the book of Kuzari. Let's just review the first three and see what the theme of the fourth essay is. Achelak harishon shel hasefer, dan bereshito shel ha'inyan ha'eloki, mimei Adam harishon ba'ad yitziat Mitzrayim. If we were to thematically sort of give a one-sentence description of the first essay of the Kuzari, it would be to discuss the historical Inyan HaEloki as it existed from the times of Genesis, from the times of Adam until the Exodus. And then I guess really post-Exodus, because he has a long discussion of the golden calf, right? But it's a historical depiction of how God introduced himself to the Jewish people, how God introduced himself to the forefathers, how God embedded within a certain strand of mankind, a certain genetic quality. All of that is sort of the historical underpinnings of how the divinity finds its way into the human experience. That's the first essay. Now, you may question this and you say, well, I associate the first essay to a whole disputation between different faith leaders, the Christian priest and the Muslim imam, and the Greek philosopher and the Jewish rabbi. But in reality, that's just the first few pages of the Kuzari. right? But the bulk of the Sefer really is what Rav Toledano is describing. The bulk of that first essay is to really go through what God had in mind when he created the world and why he chose one nation out of all of the others, and what the makeup of divinity is when God first embedded it within humankind. Okay, that's the theme of the first essay, the history of God's divinity in man in the early stages of creation through the Exodus. החלק השני של הספר דן בקיומו של העניין האלוקי בארץ ישראל, בלשון הקודש, ובעם ישראל גם בזמן החורבן, וגם בתוך הצרות של עם ישראל. Second essay, what's the theme? The theme is the duration of the inyan ha'eloki, this divinity within the world, where it is focused in the land of Israel, because if you recall, the first part of the second essay dedicated itself to a whole discussion about how Eretz Yisrael is the midpoint of the civilized world. If you remember, that was the whole discussion of the international dateline and the specialness of Eretz Yisrael. He then went on to the fact that this divinity infuses itself into not only specific places, not only into specific people, but also into specific language, which is why Lashon HaKodesh, Hebrew, has a special quality to it that no other language possesses. And then he then talks about how the Inyan HaEloki has continued to linger within the Jewish people even after the destruction of the temple and we were exiled from our land, and even throughout all of the travails of our people. So that's really thematically the theme of the second essay, which talks about the post-biblical period, about how the Inyan HaEloki has remained with the Jewish people. Okay? This is a nice way of framing it. Then, HaChelek HaShlishi, the third essay, which is what we just completed. Shel HaSefer Dan b'mitziuto shel ha'inyan ha'eloki b'chayei haprat. It deals with how divinity rests within the life of the individual. Now, b'chayav shel ha'tzadik ha'yehudi ha'mekayem et mitzvot ha'torah. How it dwells within the life of the righteous person, what the Rabbi Yehuda Levi had called the chassid, the pious individual, or the saintly individual. And I guess the reason thematically for creating a separate essay, according to this thesis of Rav Toledano, is it's one thing to say that the Inyan HaEloki can rest within a nation or in macro things, but to say that it rests within each and every individual who, through his piety, is able to find God in everyday existence takes it to a completely new level. And that's why there's a new theme for the third ma'amar, the third essay. Now, that's thematically true about maybe the first half of the third ma'amar. But what does he do with the whole discussion of Karaism and defending rabbinic Judaism that's contained in the third ma'amar? That Rav Toledano does not discuss. So it's a little bit problematic. He sort of glosses over that. We'll talk about that in just a second. HaChelek HaRevi'i, now that we get to the fourth ma'amar, which is the penultimate ma'amar, because there's going to be a fifth ma'amar as well, but the fourth ma'amar, Ka'amur Dan B'inyan HaEloki B'Torah, will deal with how we can find divinity within the words of the Torah itself, which instructs us and which provides the message of prophecy. Okay? So that's the theme of this fourth ma'amar, and that's why we're going to be analyzing text, first with the names of God, and then with various prophecies and anthropomorphic terms that are used to describe Hashem, and the wisdom of Am Yisrael, which doesn't really deal with the divinity of the Torah, but I guess in a broader sense, the Torah that is possessed by the Jewish people. So then he says, in summary, the sikum Achelek harishon mityaches lazman, hasheni leolam, ashlishi lanefesh, v'harvi'i laTorah. Fascinating the way he presents it, right? He says the first essay is dedicated to time because its theme is human history. The second is dedicated to space, which he calls the world, right? Zman and Olam are time and space. The third is dedicated to the individual soul. And the fourth is dedicated to the Torah that God gave us to represent divine will. Shloshet harishonim mityachsim imkein l'shloshet hameimadim olam shana nefesh shel sefer yitzira, v'harvi'i michil perush l'sefer yitzira atzmo. Now, as we're going to see, Sefer Yetzirah contains a tripartite theme to it, which is what is called Olam, Shana, and Nefesh, space, time, and soul. We are used to thinking about existence in two parts, time and space. But in the Sefer Yetzirah language, there's three parts to existence. There's time, space, and soul, meaning a spiritual quality or spiritual dimension, almost like there's three dimensions of space, one dimension of time, and then an extra dimension of the spiritual, which is what we call the nefesh of the world, or the nefesh of the individual. And what we're going to see is that there is a linkage in Sefer Yetzirah between time, space, and soul. So we're going to see a bunch of charts in Sefer Yetzirah that links 12 months of the year to 12 constellations of the zodiac, which is linking time and space together. And then that in turn will be linked to 12 different components of the spiritual makeup of the human being. So just to sort of foreshadow for you, but basically what Rav Toledano is suggesting is that the first three sections of the Kuzari correspond to those three sections or those three components of what makes up all of existence, which is time, space, and soul. And the fourth essay contains a commentary on those three realms, which is part of its breaking down of the knowledge of the Torah that was granted to Bnei Israel. Okay, now what is the purpose of the fifth essay? It hasn't told us yet. We'll have to wait till we get there. But what I can tell you is that the fifth essay is very different from the first four essays of the Kuzari. And because it's so different, many times when people study Sefer Kuzari, they only study the first four ma'amarim, and they completely don't study the fifth ma'amar, which I think is a mistake. I think it's a mistake to take a work like Sefer HaKuzari and only study it in part. There are parts of it which are difficult or more dry and whatever. And when we studied Kuzari, we actually did gloss over the section on the international dateline, and we just went over it outside. But at least we have to be knowledgeable of what its contents are. And there are really some great gems in the fifth Ma'amar. The fifth Ma'amar devotes itself to a study or an analysis of philosophy of various different kinds that were known to Rebbe Yehuda Halevi, and to sort of demonstrate that some of those philosophical ideas can be adopted to help enhance our knowledge of the Torah as well. So that's something that we'll have to wait. We'll get to that bridge when we cross it. But this at least is where we are in the context of the work. Okay, at this point we'll take. There's one last thing I want to mention, where I find Rav Toledano's analysis very satisfying on one level, but there's still some gaps in this overarching structure that he's left for us that may leave us with some questions as to why Rebbe Yehuda Halevi put a piece of information in and why he put it in at that particular juncture in the Sefer. We will try to make sense of it to the best of our ability. I also do want to point out, and I've made reference to this work many times over the course of our discussion of the Kuzari, a work by Yochanan Silman, which was published many years ago, maybe 30 years ago. I'm not sure exactly, maybe 40 years ago. I forget now. But it is, the English title is Philosopher and Prophet. That's the main title, and understandings the structure of Rebbe Yehuda Halevi's Kuzari, I think is what the subtitle is. And in that work, Professor Silman observes that the Kuzari was most likely written over the course of at least 2 decades, and that it's altogether possible that the third Ma'amar was originally written first and was originally meant as a standalone project. And then Rabbi Yehuda Halevi expanded his project and wrote the first 2 and the last 2 Ma'amarim, and really reworked the third essay to make it part of a larger work. That would certainly help explain why the third Ma'amar has this unique feature, in that whereas the first 2 and the third and the 4th and 5th essays really deal with defending Judaism against its external detractors, the third Ma'amar deals with defending Judaism from its internal detractors, namely the Karaites. Okay, and it's really thematically quite different, and it almost harkens back to the project of Rebbe Sadia Gaon, who was really an opponent of Karaism. And that's really what Rebbe Yehuda Halevi was doing a lot in the third essay. I don't know necessarily that that will help explain everything, but it certainly helps explain why the third Ma'amar has this discussion of Karaism, because using the structure presented by Rav Toledano, there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason if the third essay is all about the Inyana Eloki that's found within the individual. Okay? All right. Questions or comments before we go on to the Parsha? Okay. Yes. Okay, so the first essay Rav Toledano suggested is Shana, time. Okay, because the word Shana meaning year, okay? So that corresponds to time because it documents ancient history of what God had in mind when he passed down his divinity within us, within Adam, and that passed down to a certain strand of his descendants through Shet, through Seth. That made its way to the Avot, which made its way to the tribes, 12 tribes, which made its way down to all of the Klal Yisrael. And it's sort of like a history of how the Inyan HaElokim evolved and progressed in early human history to the point where we find it now. That's Zman, that's Shana, right? Time. Space, he wanted to suggest, is the second essay, which focuses on the divinity finding its place in certain places in the world, particularly in Eretz Yisrael, and even after the destruction, finding its place within the Jewish people wherever they dwell. Okay, so that's space, or what we would call olam. Okay, and then finally, the third ma'amar corresponds to nefesh, because it focuses on the individual pious person's ability to find divinity in his or her life as an individual. So that corresponds to nefesh, okay? And chelek revi'i corresponds to the Torah, which transmits this knowledge, some of it esoteric and some of it quite straightforward, about how the Inyan HaEloki manifests itself in that tripartite system. Okay. So let's close this, but I'm going to open up the screen for the Parsha. Let's see. I don't have my mouse today, so sorry, I'm at a disadvantage. Can everyone see the new screen? I hope you can all see the new screen. Please scream if you can't see the new screen. Okay. All right. So our Dvar Torah for today Parshat Vayakhel Shkalim, be mindful of your aura. Be mindful of your aura. So you'll understand what I'm about, what this title is about in just a minute. Our parsha opens, and it's just Vayakhel the Shabbos because we're in a leap year, and it's also Parshat Shkalim. We start the first of the four special readings, and we'll read from once again from Kitisa this Shabbos. So, Vayakhel Moshe et kol adat b'nei Yisrael vayomer alehem. Moshe gathers all of the nation together, and he speaks to them, and he says, "These are the things that God has commanded." And what the opening commandment that Moshe presents to Bnei Yisrael after he has gathered to them is Sheishet Yamim Te'aseh Melacha. For 6 days you shall do work, okay, and rest on the Sabbath. So this is the introductory paragraph, and the rest of the parsha is dedicated to Moshe's command to the Jewish people to build the Mishkan, and it documents how they built the Mishkan under the guidance of Bitzalel and Oholiav, the two great contractors of the Mishkan. Okay, fantastic. So I just want to present to you first a question that is asked by the Or HaChaim, or Chaim Atar, on this statement that Moshe gathered the people. Tzarich ladat ta'am shehutzrach lomar vayakhel. Why does the Torah have to make a point of saying that Moshe gathered the people? Achar shehu davar haragil b'chol eit asher yitzaveh davar Hashem. Isn't this what Moshe did anytime he had to provide a teaching to Klal Yisrael? He would gather the people together and say, I want to tell you what God has said. So before we answer this question, why does the Torah have to make a specific point to Dafka over here to say that Hashem that Moshe gathered the people together to give them the commandment of Shabbos? There are a number of answers to this question, by the way. Some say that the very nature of Shabbat requires a gathering together of the people. I saw a beautiful interpretation from the Beis Yaakov of Ishbitz, where he says that this was a tikkun for the Chet HaEgel. The Jewish people gathered together to build the calf. Vayikahel ha'edah, or Vatikahel ha'edah, I think is what the pasuk says. The people gathered around Aharon and they said, Kum aselanu Elohim, make for us a God. And so Moshe wants to make a tikkun for gathering together for something terrible by gathering them together to learn about the Shabbos. But we're going to see specifically why, if we put it in its context of connecting the beginning of our parsha to the very end of last week's parsha. So the Or HaChaim is going to do that, but in order for us to understand it, let's look at the last few psukim of last week's parsha. Moshe comes down from Mount Sinai the second time with the second set of tablets. Vayhi beredet Moshe mehar Sinai. This is from the end of Parshat Kitisa. Ushnei luchoto idut biyad Moshe beridato min hahar. He's got the two tablets as he descends from the mountain. Umoshe lo yada ki karan or panav b'dabero ito. Moshe is completely unaware that the skin on his face is emanating this aura of light. Okay? Vayar Aharon b'chol b'nei Yisrael et Moshe v'hinei karan or panav. Aaron and all of Bnei Israel take note of this, these rays of light that are shooting out of Moshe's face. Vayireu nigeshet elav. And they are fearful of approaching him. Vayikra alehem Moshe vayeshuv elav Aharon b'chol hanesiim ba'ida vayidaber Moshe alehem. Moshe calls out to them, calls out to the elders, he calls out to the people, come chevra, come back, come back. Aharon and the leaders come back, and Moshe speaks to them. And then once everyone else in the nation sees that the coast is clear, everyone else then started to assemble. And Moshe then gives charge, starts to explain to the people what God has commanded him. Remember, he came down the first time, didn't have a chance to speak to the people, because as he's on his way down, he sees them with the golden calf and he breaks the tablets. This is not a time to start teaching them about the Torah and what he's received at Har Sinai. So this is really the first time when he gets the second tablets that he can start instructing the people about what's contained in the Torah. Vayakhel Moshe midaber itam vayiten al panav masveh. And after Moshe was finished speaking to them, he put his mask back on. Right? See, we have masks too. Not to cover our aura, but I don't know. Anyway, maybe there's a message there. But let's take a look. So now that we have this background information, let's take a look at the Or HaChaim's answer. He says, "V'nir'eh ki letzad shera'u ki karan or panav vayira'u migeshet elav." He says, it seems to me that at the end of last week's parsha, the people were afraid of gathering around Moshe and coming to listen to him. Lazeh hutzrach lahakilat kulan laval yimnu'u kitzat mehamorah. And that's why the Torah makes a point of telling us now that Moshe is gathering them in. It's basically a recap of what we read in last week's parsha, where Moshe called out to everyone and says, Chevra, assemble, don't be afraid, okay? V'zeh shedikdek lomar et kol adat. And that's why the pasuk says, et kol adat, the entire congregation, is because people were really quite afraid of him, especially the various different echelons, not just the leadership, but the regular people were just scared of him. They didn't understand why, this phenomenon was occurring. It was very frightening to them. Now, there's more to it than that as far as the gathering. And the only thing that the Or HaChaim has not explained is, why is it that when Moshe gathers them back, the first thing he teaches them about is Shabbos? Why is that? And what's the connection? Is there any connection between the fact that the people were afraid, they didn't want to come close? Moshe has to assemble them and say, don't be afraid, come near, and I want to tell you something. And the very first thing he tells them is, Sheshet yamim te'aseh melacha, work for 6 days, rest on the seventh. What's the connection? So I'm going to show you something fascinating from the Chidah, which we'll look at in just a moment. But before we do that, one more stop, which is a passage of Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, Daf Pechet, which talks about the aftermath of the golden calf. So Darash Rabbi Simai said, B'sha'a she'ikdimu Yisrael na'aseh l'nishma, when the Jewish people said na'aseh v'nishma, and they had this amazing epiphany that they would commit themselves to performing the will of Hashem even before they knew what was contained in the Torah. Ba'u shishim ribo shel malachei hasharet, l'chol echad ve'echad misrael kashru lo shnei ktarim, echad keneged na'aseh, ve'echad keneged nishma. When the Jews said na'aseh v'nishma, it was an amazing thing. It represented an absolute and total commitment on behalf of the Jewish people. And as a result, 600,000 angels came, corresponding to the 600,000 males who were assembled there. And for each one, they brought down 2 crowns, one for Nasa and one for Nishma, and put it on each one's head. Okay? Kevan shechatu Yisrael, yardu me'avi asrim ribo malachei chabala upirekum. But once the Jewish people sinned with the golden calf, twice as many destructive angels came. And as the Meforshim explain, because they sinned with the golden calf, they uncoupled the Naaseh from the Nishma. They demonstrated that they weren't prepared to unconditionally follow God. They needed to understand things and maybe interpret on their own. That's what the golden calf represents. And so they uncoupled Naaseh from Nishma. So you now needed 2 angels, each one to take a separate crown, whereas one angel could bring both crowns together because they were attached. So 1.2 million angels now come, 2 angels per person, and they remove those crowns. Shenemar, and how do we know that? As it says, Vayitanatzalu b'nei Yisrael et edyam me'ar chorev, that the Jewish people removed their adi. What is adi in Hebrew? How do you translate adi? It's beauty, something very like jewelry, like an adornment. They removed their adornment, which is a reference to these crowns, these spiritual crowns. They removed them. They were forced to remove them after the sin. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, and we're skipping a line or two, but Rabbi Yochanan comments on that and says, "V'kulan zacha Moshe v'natlan," that Moshe was able to take all of those crowns of the 600,000, those 1.2 million crowns, and he absorbed them on his own. In other words, those crowns didn't dissipate, but rather Moshe took them for himself. And Meshlakis just adds that eventually God will return the crowns to Bnei Israel. Now that you have that little piece of information, let's try to put all of this together. So the first thing we noted is that Moshe needs to gather the people because they were fearful of his aura and they started to disperse. Moshe gathers them in, says the Or HaChaim, in order to dispel their fears and to reassure them that everything is safe. And he gives them the commandment. Let's also note that the crowns that the Jewish people had acquired at Matan Torah were removed from them and given instead to Moshe. What's the connection? So now let's take a look at the Chida, one of the preeminent students of the Arizal, Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, and let's see what he writes in his Sefer Pnei David. So let's take a look. Vayakhel Moshe et kol adat b'nei Yisrael vayomer aleihem, Eile hadivarim asher tziva Hashem la'asot otam. Sheishet yamim te'aseh melacha, uvayom hashvi. He just quotes the psukim to open. He says, Shamati omrim. He says, I have heard people saying, V'amesha katuv b'shas perek Rabbi Akiva b'perek vayitnatzlu, or b'pasuk vayitnatzlu b'nei Yisrael et hajam u'Moshe yikach et ol shekol adiyei Yisrael asher nistalka zacha Moshe v'natlam. He says, based on what the Gemara says, that Moshe took all of those crowns and took them for himself, v'zeh shekatuv u'Moshe yikach et ha'ohel, lashon or shalakach kol ha'orot me'adiyei Yisrael, or me'adiyei Yisrael. That the aura of light that emanated off Moshe, that was a representation of all of those crowns that Bnei Israel had received. Moshe absorbs all of them, so to speak, and that's the aura that is bouncing off his face. Now, when you consider for a moment that the Torah does not document that Moshe had this aura when he came down the first time. It's only when he comes down the second time that he has this aura. And so it would certainly explain why he only had this aura now after the second Luchot, because basically he was reclaiming all of the crowns of Bnei Israel for himself, and that's what was emanating from him. The Amaru HaMekubalim. Now let's take a look at what the Kabbalists say. De Moshe be'an vitanuto lo ratza likham lo legamre. He says Moshe, in his humility, did not want to take those crowns. Who wants to have an aura at the expense of others? I should take your crown, and that should be my aura. That should be the thing that I am distinguished by. Rak shmurim li Yisrael. But rather, Moshe was basically holding on to them to preserve them for the sake of returning them to the Jewish people. Uvechol Shabbat machzirim otam li Yisrael. Ve'hein hein nishamot yeterot li Yisrael. He says, every Shabbos, Moshe restores some of the crown's glory to the Jewish people. And so when we talk about the neshama yisera, the additional soul that we all attain on Shabbos, it's Moshe basically taking some of the holy crowns that we lost after the Chet HaEgel and giving some of it back to us on Shabbos Kodesh. That's what happens, is that we are able to regain some semblance of the pre-golden calf status on Shabbat. Ve'al zeh anu omrim yismach Moshe b'matnat chelko. And that's why on Shabbos morning, the Amidah is, which doesn't really have anything to do with Shabbos at all, when you think about it. We started off by saying, Yismach Moshe b'matnat chelko. Moshe will rejoice because of the gift of his portion. And the way the Chida is reading it is b'matnat chelko dafka. Moshe doesn't want the rest of the crowns. He wants to share them with Bnei Israel. And on Shabbos, he rejoices because he's given away all the crowns, and all he has left is his own portion. All he's got is his own crown. Ki eino rotzeh lehanot me'acherim ad kan devar, because he doesn't want to benefit from the failure of Bnei Israel and to get their crowns. V'zeh shekatuv Vayakhel Moshe et kol adat Bnei Israel. And that's why the Torah over here says that Moshe gathers Bnei Israel, and notice that the name for Bnei Israel is not just Vayakhel Moshe et Bnei Israel, but rather Vayakhel Moshe et kol adat Bnei Israel. And the word Edah, which is a congregation, comes from the word Lashon Adi, comes from the word adornment. Adat and Adi, very close. So basically what he's doing is, Ki Moshe kavatz kol adiyei Yisrael, Ki Moshe katuv, Moshe yikach. So Moshe gathers the Bnei Israel together in order to diffuse off of himself the crowns that he's acquired. Omnam nahag tovat ayin va'amar li Yisrael, va'yinachem otam, ki yesh lahem tikva sheyachzeru lahem edyam ayedei shmirat Shabbat. And what Moshe was trying to do was to comfort Bnei Israel by letting them know that even though I possess your crowns, you can regain those crowns through Sabbath observance. Zeh shekatuv ela hadvarim, uvayom hashevi'i yihiyeh lachem kodesh v'tizku ba'adi yechem. That what Moshe was basically telling them about the Sabbath is that Shabbos is the time when you regain your crowns. So even though, unfortunately, I've been the beneficiary of your sin and I've gained all of your crowns, I share those crowns with you. You will get those crowns back on Shabbos. I'll be happy, you'll be happy, and you'll be elevated. Now, this is a beautiful idea that links all of the different ideas together. Now we understand why Moshe has to gather them. They're fearful, but we also understand that his aura is a manifestation of the crowns that were given to him that Bnei Israel had previously had on their own. It also explains why the very first thing that Moshe presents to them when he gathers them in is to talk to them about Shabbos, the time when they can regain their crowns. But what occurs to me, through this whole discussion, is that all of us project an aura. You think about it. The Torah says that Moshe was not aware that this aura was shining off of his face. But what the Chida is telling us is an added dimension. Moshe didn't realize that the aura that he had was a product of the failure of Bnei Israel. How often is it that we project an aura in the presence of someone who perceives that that person represents my failure? In other words, I can look at someone else and I can see how accomplished they are and all of the amazing things that they're doing with their life. And it reminds me of my own shortcomings, of my own lack of success in those areas where I was hoping that I would excel. And I see it off of the aura of the other person who's been able to take those crowns that I thought I could work with. I thought that I would have those crowns. And instead that person has taken that particular pathway, whether, that person has excelled in business or homemaking or writing or teaching Torah or leadership or anything else that you can think of, where you look at someone else and you see the aura that you thought you would be able to project and you see it projecting off of another. We have to be very careful of our auras, And each one of us projects an aura, because I guarantee you, as much as you see an aura off of somebody else, someone else sees an aura projecting off of you as well. And the important thing to remember is that when you project an aura, you cause people to run away sometimes, because your success is a reminder to them, perhaps, of their own failure. I've been on both ends of that, and try to be conscious of it. When I've failed in a certain aspect and I see someone else succeeding, it's intimidating and it's off-putting, naturally, because you say, on the one hand, I want to learn from that person, but on the other hand, it reminds me of my failure. But then, on the other hand, I see Moshe as the great leader saying, I don't want to capitalize off of your failed experience. Come close. Let me share with you my aura. And that's what we're supposed to be learning from this as well. Share your aura with other people. Be careful about how you project your aura. And if you see that there are other people that maybe are at a distance, bring them close, gather them together, and provide them a message that allows them to realize that you want to share that aura with them. You want to share that success with them instead of holding on to it for yourself. Because you should feel like Moshe. Yismach Moshe b'matanat chelko. When is a person truly happy? Not only when I've succeeded, but when my success can be enjoyed by others or shared with others. Yes? And not keeping people at a distance. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to, we'll start section 4, the 4th essay, Bezrat Hashem, next week, and we'll move on from there, and we'll continue. Okay, any questions, comments? Let's take a look. Wide, quiet group today. All right. So anyway, have a wonderful week, and we'll see you soon. Let me see how I turn this off. Stop the share. And I hope everyone's doing well. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Kropkin.
Thank you.
Rini